All right, well, thanks for being here, I guess.
I'm here every day.
Yeah, I knew that. So, right now, before we get into the questions of the topic at hand, we need to ask a little bit of you, just to get an idea of who you are. And
Okay.
So let's start off with the basics. For the camera, can you tell us?
I was born very small. I got bigger. 1966, Sherman Hospital, Elgin, February 7th. Tim Vaulato, born. Lived 51 years so far. Hope for another at least 20. I don't want to overthink it. I graduated from U46 school, known as Barker Hospital. In 1984, I spent 4 years at ECC, had 117 credits. Yeah, I know it's a 2-year school. I should have really thought through that. Went to Northern for another 3 years. On top of that, got my bachelorate in education. Very close to having a secondary one in printmaking, which will be my fallback if I ever give up education. I'm going straight into counterfeiting money. I've taught in school district U46 for 26 years. I've taught everything from elementary through middle school, through high school. I've taught every section of art in high school, with the exception of digital, because by the time we actually had a digital studio, I was a senior art teacher and I could pick and choose what I wanted to teach. Anything else? I got a wife, I got 2 kids, I got 2 dogs, and a python. I play in 2 bands. Something about number 2.
Oh, you also had a pug.
Pug died. It was very sad. Should I go on with the pug? Let's move on with the story.
Let's move on. All right.
People weepy.
Can you tell us what your experience in your life has been with comic books? Probably starting from early on, and then.
Okay. Okay. So probably when I was about in 2nd grade, I do remember a few random comics my dad would bring home from Downtown News, which was a comic store in Elgin. Well, it wasn't a comic store; it was a newspaper magazine place, but they did carry comics. And he would go out there on a Saturday after he did his banking. Everybody did banking when I was a kid on the weekend. And he would bring me back a comic. He would never get them in order. So if the story was continued, I had no idea what it was. So I would read the story, and then in my little head, I'd have to make up the story. And then by the time I was 2, I realized every time we'd go out to eat at the Manor Pancake House, that Ben Franklin, which was a little department, what would you call Ben Franklin? Yeah, she's gone. What would you call Ben Franklin? It wasn't even a drugstore. Just like a 5 and dime, which is something you guys don't know about either. But they would, this is horrible, I feel so old. Back in the days we had to water and feed the horses before we'd take them on a long ride. We would go to this little 5 and dime store and they would have a rack of comic books. So I would get a comic book that would stop me from being a brat when my parents would go out to eat. And so I was cool with going out to eat every Friday night, because every Friday night I get a new comic. And then eventually, as I got older, I started doing chores and getting money so I could buy multiple comics. And then the stories actually became sequential. One would lead into the other. And that's kind of where I got really into comic books. I would often take a piece of paper, throw it over the top of the cover, trace the cover, and then make my own superhero out of the pose of that cover. And those were kind of my first steps, and also learning to draw and just really basic storytelling. I mean, on a really, primitive childhood level.
Right. Did you have any favorites that you can think of?
Oh yeah, X-Men. X-Men. Howard the Duck, because it was just weird. Because it was trapped in a world he never made, Howard the Duck. And he had a human girlfriend, very bizarre for that time period, I would think. Actually, very bizarre for now. Now I'm really thinking it through. Her on the bed with Howard the Duck.
All right.
But, so Howard the Duck I would read. Also, X-Men. I really started reading in 2nd grade the all-new X-Men, because the original X-Men were Cyclops, Beast, Angel, Iceman, Marvel Girl. Well, on issue 94, they got all new X-Men, and there was a king-size one that I later traded from a buddy of mine who still brings it up to this day, that he traded me really what was essentially the all-new X-Men #1. And it had Wolverine, which, obviously has become a major character now. Colossus, Nightcrawler, Sunfire, who left after the first issue, Thunderbird, who died in the first issue, Banshee, and Storm. So that was kind of the all-new X-Men.
All right. Thinking back on comics now, when you were a kid, did you ever think about the people behind the comics, the people who were making them?
As I got older, yeah, because I started to see certain comics I liked that had a certain artist. The one who really affected me the most, and actually I would daydream in his art style, that's how much I love that guy's stuff, was John Byrne. And right around issue, oh God, I'm trying to do the math, 110 of the all-new Uncanny X-Men, John Byrne came in and started drawing Wolverine. And what's really interesting, if you watch any of these documentaries on comic books, every time they show the X-Men, 1 out of 3 pictures is John Byrne's X-Men. That's what, canon-wise, people tend to picture when they picture Storm or Colossus or Wolverine, is the way that John Byrne drew them. And he would save comics. Like if they were talking about canceling the Hulk, they'd throw John Byrne there to draw it, and suddenly the Hulk would get a big boost in sales, or Captain America, or even the Fantastic Four. For a while there, he was kind of known as the dude they would bring in to save whatever book was dying.
So, would you say that comic book artists had sort of like a reputation to hold? Like, do you believe that in a lot of ways that they, to comic book readers, were a type of celebrity, or?
It was a really, really niche market. Yeah, a lot of kids read comic books. Not too many kids took it as seriously as me and some of my friends did. Like, we kind of worshipped those guys. And when we were 17, we got a chance to hop up a train to Chicago and go to a comic book convention and actually meet John Byrne and meet Wendy Penny. And I got all their signatures in one of my sketchbooks at home. And Ron Wilson was there, and Bill Sienkiewicz. No, that's not right. Who was the guy that drew Thor? I think it was Bill Sienkiewicz. Walt Simonson, not Bill Sienkiewicz. Ron Wilson, just a ton of people. And the funniest part about that is I was in photo class in high school, and I took a ton of photos, and later on my best friend, who I would meet in college, said he was at the show, and when we went back and looked through the photos, he was sitting like 2 rows in front of me at all the panel discussions. So it was just weird that, 4 years later I'd meet this guy, and that had nothing to do with anything. Keep filming.
All right, so Image Comics. When was the first time you remember hearing about it?
It was a lot of big news in the comic book industry about how these guys had left Marvel and decided to do their own creator produced comics. And the funny thing is, and these numbers may be slightly exaggerated or possibly even under-exaggerated at this point, but standard canon of belief was these guys went from getting paid maybe $1,800 an issue, which sounds like a lot of money until you realize it might take them a month to draw an issue. So you would have to live on $1,800 a month in New York City is nothing. You might actually qualify for food stamps in the early 80s if that was your income. So they went from doing that to when they went to Image, they got all the profits. And the story has always been told that the guy who did Spawn, his first gross paycheck was $1.2 million. Now, granted, he brought a whole bunch of people. He got famous at Marvel first, and that's why people wanted to check him out doing his own thing. So, I mean, he had to build up a fan base to get a paycheck of $1.2 million. But in his first year, he grossed mainly around $18 million drawing a comic book. And if you gauge that next to most fine artists, even nowadays, most fine artists are not making that kind of money. That's a huge amount of cash to make.
All right, so
now, next question. Are you going to ask me, was Image better?
Well, I was going to ask, what was like the first Image comic you picked up,
Spawn,
or what was the one?
Spawn #1.
Spawn #1?
Yeah, and it's interesting because there was a lot of really beautiful artwork in there, and not so great storytelling.
I remember once you told me one of the problems you had with it, or maybe like one of the problems like the comic suffered from itself, was splash pages. Do you think that might have been a consequence from having to shift over from this big company that was, you know, but this? Do you believe that was a steady paycheck? Do you believe like maybe the pay difference might have affected that, or
The pay difference affected everything with how that, like he had a set goal that Spawn was supposed to die after the first year. Well, here, let me run this back. Spawn had X amount of number, and if you read the first 12 issues or the first 6, because I think you rethought that pretty quickly, Spawn had X amount of power, and every time he would use his power, he would lose some of that power. When his power was all done, because his power came from Satan, he would have to go be judged by Satan. Now, if he had killed a lot of bad guys and sent their souls to hell to power Satan, then that actually was good for Satan. But if you let the bad guys do bad things and live, that also was good for Satan. So it was this weird catch-22 he was in. He couldn't win if you killed him. He couldn't win if you let him go. So he just, being him, ended up killing most of them. Now, at the end of that year, he was supposed to have all of his powers gone, and then he would be judged, and then you would find the final fate of Spawn. And then the next year, he had the idea he would tell the story of the Dark Ages Spawn. You know, and there was going to be a different Spawn every year. Well, when you're making $18 million a year on one property, your desire to kill your character goes way down. You know, you realize that's a cash cow. So he didn't kill off Spawn. In fact, the whole reason you see him carrying guns and being that kind of badass that he was in the first comics was because he didn't want to use his power, because he knew when the power was gone, he'd be judged before Satan. And he could use it here and there. He could use it to make himself look human for a few hours, or he could stop the world and use it up all at once, but then he would be immediately judged.
all right?
So he was trying to milk that, at least in the original concept.
I suppose. No, the information is useful. Believe it or not, this information is it's interesting, at least in my opinion.
I have the guy who created Spawn, Todd McFarlane, I have an action figure of him at home. I just want to point that out.
Wait,
I've never opened it. I completely geek boyed it. You know, because I was like, why would I open a package of Todd McFarlane? I'd be like, come on, now we're going to go draw at the drawing table. That would be a really stupid action figure move, all right?
All right. I guess the question that I was really asking earlier was, do you believe that the reason why there was so much like splash pages was because, you know, this guy was
a poor story writer? Yeah.
Well,
exactly.
Not just that, but
no, that's what it was. Because later on, when he started making that kind of money, he hired Neil Gaiman, who wrote American Gods, which is now on every Sunday night, and wrote Sandman. And he hired Alan Moore to write issues, and Frank Miller to write issues of Spawn. And those issues were generally interesting and much better. But they set a pace for him of how he should illustrate, and it wasn't one page of panels, splash page, 2 pages of panels, double splash page. Because the problem with having a splash page every other page is you spend just as much time looking at that splash page as one panel. So you would feel like you read an issue of Spawn in under 3 minutes, because it was all splash pages. And that's what artists like to draw. We don't like to think that much. We want to do the big, exciting, you know, drawing. But a job of a cartoonist or a comic book artist is to tell a story. And you have to do that sequentially in panels. It can't just be, ha-ha, look how cool I am here. Ha-ha, I got swords here. Ha-ha, I got a gun here. You know, that doesn't really tell the story. You already understand that. So you need something different to move the story along.
all right. So next question is, what did you ever like see like any of the other comics published by like Image Comics, and do you have any thoughts on those? Or
I do. It's really funny, and I can't think of the artist. I want to say it's Dave Keown, but that could be wrong because it was over 20 years ago. There's a guy who created a comic book called Pit, and Pit was like the greasy, angry, goth version of the Hulk. And it was really well drawn, and the first issue was incredibly interesting. Well, he got his cut, you know, he got his $1 million profit. Cut his motivation to draw another issue down to almost nothing. It took 5 years, I think, for him to put out 3 issues. So when that happened, yeah, that kind of wrecked a guy who had a really promising comic book career into just like, oh, I can be lazy, I got $1 million. Well, this will tide me over for a while. So that was sad. The Wildcats were interesting, but not very well written. And that seemed to be their biggest problem over at Image, is they had really great looking characters. They had even some ones with really cool powers. They just didn't have a decent story. And if you don't have a decent story, you can't have an interesting comic.
So, what was the response you saw from fans and really just the comic book industry in general?
Well, it's kind of like the death of Superman. Everybody clamored on because it was big news. But if you go back now in hindsight and you try to read some of the stuff, it wasn't very good. It was overblown hype. And a lot of people went, you know, to Image and were like, bought a lot of Image stuff. And then after a while, the hype died down, and either you really liked it or you went on and you found different comics. A lot of people went back to Marvel. A lot of comic book artists like Jim Lee, the guy who created Wildcats, who has since sold Wildcats to Marvel. Don't know how that really happened because I wasn't that interested. He started getting paid more. Instead of getting $1,800 an issue for a month's work, suddenly he was getting 40 grand. Like he did when he restarted the Fantastic Four, or started drawing the Fantastic Four, they started paying him like a rock star. Now, I don't think it's that today. In fact, I would think a lot of comic book artists have taken a huge cut because the money's really in the movies. And Marvel doesn't own the rights to make the X-Men movies. Well, Disney doesn't own the rights to make the X-Men movies. Disney owns Marvel, just in case you didn't know that. But they sold off a bunch of movie rights to other movie companies before Disney purchased Marvel. Which is why Guardians of the Galaxy came out. It's a nothing title, but Disney owns it. So they're going to make it into something. And they did. They did a very good job at it. Even ignoring all the stories. Okay, go on. Vaulato, shut up.
No, this is fine. All right, so, sorry, I gotta recollect myself right here.
That's all right.
I kind of drawing a blank.
I used to collect comics. I don't anymore. Yeah. I don't monthly go out and get anything. I will go buy bound issues, but that's it. I mean, it's hard for me because like my biggest problem with what has happened to the comic book industry is the storylines have been so screwed with. It's kind of like if you saw Sleeping Beauty and you saw the movie Maleficent. There are two different, like Maleficent's the bad girl in Sleeping Beauty and she has to die. And then there's the one where they made her the good person. That's what's happened with comic books, is the storylines are all over the place. And Marvel just destroyed all reality and redid the Marvel Universe. So now instead of having Wolverine, you have a very old Wolverine, like Old Man Logan, and you have the gender-bending girl Wolverine. And it's like, what just happened to Wolverine? Ah, no, we got these two. Seriously? How do we keep up with the story? You know, and if you kill a character 7, 8 times, it doesn't have any effect when you kill them the 10th. And that's really what has happened with so many of the storylines, is there's been too much in the 50 or 60 years that Marvel's been around and the almost 80 years that DC's been around, that every time they try to do something new, they start to ignore the past history, for better or worse. But it's just, I get to the point where I don't care anymore. You know, I'd rather go watch Doctor Who, because at least every time he dies, he regenerates, so it's kind of like there's a continuity there. That one's not a great example.
All right, so you talked about so Image Comics is really all about creators maintaining like their rights over their work, and you talked about the negatives of what seemed to happen at Image Comics and the poor writing that came out of that for some of the works, and you've also talked about with companies that own properties, and now sometimes those properties are damaged by the company.
Mm-hmm.
Really, what do you think about the two? Like, do you think that each one has like their benefits, or do you believe one's better than the other?
You know what? It's really weird because I've always been that the creator should get a cut. Like, I mean, if you create Wolverine, and a lot of people have actually led to the creation of Wolverine, you should get a small percentage. Just something to say, hey, now I get it. The company is taking all the risk, whether they're paying for the printing of the comic, they're paying for the distribution of the comic, they're paying for the advertising of the comic. Right, okay, they get the lion's share. They should have the lion's share. They're the ones putting up the risk. But the guy who created it should get a little something back to make him want to come create things for you. Because if you create Wolverine and then suddenly you see somebody make all this money off of Wolverine, you're not going to give that guy any decent work from here on in. You're going to be like, my next character is Mole Man, and he'll have a mole stick, and when he does his mole call, moles will come from out of the ground and suck you down. You know, I've been bitten by a radioactive pig. I'm Pig Man. No, this is horrible. You want people giving people incentive to create something. And the sad thing is Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, those guys really created an entire universe of characters that are now making millions upon billions of dollars, and none of them ever saw anything more than a paycheck. So that seems to me horribly unjust. I mean, they kept Stan Lee on as a figurehead at Marvel just so he can be in every movie. But he really did not see the money out of that he should have. In fact, he saw more money when when DC hired him away from Marvel to rewrite What If Stan Lee created Batman? What if Stan Lee created Superman? What if Stan Lee created Wonder Woman? He got $1 million an issue for his idea. $1 million an issue. I would sit down and write an issue now for $1 million an issue. And it would be good. Because I knew I had to make $1 million an issue. Okay, go on.
All right, so
what is, yeah, they've damaged the characters. Yeah. But they keep damaging the characters because they keep trying to do shocking things to make the characters interesting to the new generation.
Right. So, Image Comics, what do you think's been the impact since then? What do you think?
Image Comics was both good and bad. The best thing that it did was point out how much money comic book companies could make off a comic and how little the artist was getting. In some ways, it's led to more creators' rights, which an artist will take probably over a higher paycheck because he sees there might be a payoff in his character somewhere down the line. It has led to comic book artists being paid more fairly for what it is they have to do. And if you have to draw 30 pages a month, and some of these comic book guys are drawing 3 comics, so you're talking like 90 pages a month to make ends meet, that's a huge undertaking. I mean, I don't think I could sit down and draw for 12 hours a day. It might just kill me. Then again, so might teaching. Okay, that's what I think the good and bad is. No, it's me. I haven't turned into God yet, but thank you for worshiping at my altar.
Oh, I'm keeping that.
The power of Vaulato compels you.
All right, so. No, there's no way we're not keeping that in. That's going in no matter what. So any final thoughts?
I'm worried about the future of comic books because everything seems to be going over to digital formatting comics online, which is great. I mean, it's a new generation, it's new technology. But my heroes are heroes of the past. So it seems sad to me that at some point you may not be able to get a hardbound version of the Ultimate Spider-Man or be able to get ElfQuest, 1984 hardbound, or anything else that I used to read. It's going to be like you have to look it up online. And yeah, I got a crap load of comics at home that I should probably sell and go buy myself a few really nice guitars because I haven't touched them in 20 years. My young one read through some of them, but then he was like, these actually have words. And I'm like, oh my God, kids of today having to read. But I think to lose that format completely would be a sad thing, because they were portable. They were, you didn't have to plug them in. You didn't have to isolate yourself when you were reading a comic book. You could pass it to your friend, and you could trade off, and then you guys could talk about comics. I mean, that was one of the things I loved. We would go to the comic shop, and we'd all buy comics. And some guys would like Micronauts, and I wouldn't. But I would get to read Micronauts, because when Mike was done with Micronauts, he'd be like, hand me that X-Men. And I'd be like, here you go. And then I'd read Micronauts. So, I don't know, there's kind of a community thing that based up around it. But this may not actually even be a comic question. This might be a society question. Everybody seems trapped alone with their screen. You know what I'm saying? There's no reason for a bunch of guys to get in a car and drive to a comic shop and talk about stuff if they can sit on their cell phone and do this. It's isolating. Which you would think comic books would be the most isolating thing anybody could ever think of, but it really wasn't in our day. We would sit around and even draw them, but that's the kind of comic geeks we were. That's it. That's all I got. Overture. Hit the lights.
All right.
This is it. Night of nights. No more rehearsing or nursing our parts. It's out of my key. We know every part by heart. Can you edit in that from the old Looney Tunes?
I could try.
Overture, hit the lights. This is it. The night of nights.
You know what? I don't see why not.
Huh.
So thanks for recording with us.
Cheers.
All right.
Yeah.